So let me tell you what went down on SportsCenter, because the whole conversation about Dan Campbell's Lions really stood out. They opened up the segment by talking about where Detroit ranks in the entire NFC picture, and the way it was framed was clear. The Eagles are still sitting at the very top, a tier above everyone else, especially after how they handled the Rams in the second half of that game. But right underneath them, that's where the Lions come in, grouped together with the Buccaneers, the Packers, and the Rams as the teams with the best shot at knocking Philadelphia off their throne. Now, what made this so interesting is the way they talked about Detroit's performance against the Ravens. They didn't just squeak out a win, they out-physicaled Baltimore. You could see it in the numbers: 224 rushing yards, 7 sacks on Lamar Jackson, and their own quarterback never hitting the ground once. That's the definition of imposing your will on an opponent. And then you think back to that goal line stand in the second half, capped off by Jack Campbell forcing that fumble. It was the kind of defensive statement that sends a message across the entire conference. The panel made it clear. This version of the Lion, the one we've seen over the past couple of weeks, looks much more like the real contender than the team that stumbled in the opener against Green Bay. And when you play that physically, when you show that kind of character in big moments, you earn your place in that conversation as the primary challenger to Philadelphia. But they didn't stop there. They dug into what was maybe the biggest question hanging over Detroit heading into the season. How would they handle losing both of their coordinators? Because, remember, Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn were cornerstones of what this team built. And now you've got Joe Morton and Kelvin Shepherd stepping into those spots. The doubt was real. Even on the show, they admitted they were skeptical, because history has shown losing both coordinators in one offseason usually sets a team back. And here's where it got interesting. They talked about how Morton, the new offensive coordinator, had his face plastered all over the city after that ugly opening loss to the Packers. The talk was, did Dan Campbell pick the right guy? Did he get this hire wrong? And that pressure was real. But then Morton shows up with back-to-back strong performances, including that explosion against Chicago and then the physical, efficient game plan against Baltimore. Suddenly, the criticism quieted. Morton proved that this offense didn't have to miss a beat, and it looked like the Lions from last year before injuries piled up. The conversation even shifted into the bigger picture, how when you inherit the kind of roster Detroit has, with both receivers who've been over 1,000 yards, running backs who can put up production all over the field, and a young tight end in Sam Laporta who looks like a star, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to steady the ship. And that's exactly what Morton did, leaning into the strengths that were already there and letting this offensive line dictate the game. They also praised Kelvin Shepherd for his defensive game plan against Lamar Jackson. It wasn't something you see every week. He had linebackers spying Lamar in tandem, rushing 3, mixing coverages, and taking away Baltimore's rhythm. That's coaching, and it showed that maybe the questions about losing Aaron Glenn weren't as catastrophic as people thought. And you know what? It reminded me a little of what we hear around the NBA sometimes, especially with guys like Quentin Grimes on the Knicks. A young player or a new piece steps in, people doubt whether they can really handle the role, and then they go out and prove that they don't just fit, they elevate the system. That's what Morton and Shepherd did for Detroit in that Ravens game. They proved they belong. So yeah, SportsCenter really hammered the point that the Lions aren't just surviving after losing key staff, they're showing they can thrive. And if they keep playing with that kind of balance on both sides of the ball, then being the top challenger to the Eagles doesn't sound like an overreaction at all. So picking up where SportsCenter left off, the conversation started to turn toward accountability. You know how it goes. If we're going to raise questions when things look bad, we've got to give the same attention when a team actually answers those doubts. That's exactly what was said about Detroit. After Week 1, everyone was calling out John Morton, wondering if Dan Campbell even picked the right guy to replace Ben Johnson. And the truth is, they stunk against Green Bay. The offense looked flat, and when you take over for someone who ran a top 3 unit in the league for years, the spotlight is brutal. But here's the twist. After being put on blast, Morton delivered back-to-back weeks, where Detroit not only bounced back, but showed the kind of balance and toughness that made them dangerous last season. SportsCenter pointed out how Dan Campbell's squads under him are now 8-0 after a loss. That's not a coincidence, that's culture. And now, after 2 straight wins, the Lions have flipped the conversation. Instead of being that team people doubted, they're right back in the NFC mix as a real threat. Of course, there was also a bit of debate about whether this was really about how good Detroit actually is, or how bad Baltimore's defense has become. The panel didn't hold back. One of them flat out said, "The Ravens' defense is atrocious, and it's hard to argue with that. This is a unit that has been inconsistent all season, showing flashes of competence one week and then completely collapsing the next. For context, they've given up negative fantasy points twice this year." Now, nobody is suggesting fantasy football defines real success, but it does highlight just how ineffective that defense has been when it comes to generating pressure, forcing turnovers, or even making routine stops. That kind of volatility is a nightmare for any team trying to contend, and it makes every opponent's offense look sharper than it might actually be. So yes, Detroit deserves credit. They executed, they dominated at the line of scrimmage, and they capitalized on every mistake Baltimore made. But the lingering question remains: was this truly Detroit flexing its strength as one of the NFC's most complete teams? Or was it a case of the Ravens being completely out of sync and undermining themselves? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, but it doesn't change the fact that the Lions did exactly what a good team is supposed to do: expose weaknesses and punish them. Still, what really impressed me, and what SportsCenter kept circling back to, was Morton's approach. He didn't try to complicate things for his young offensive line after Frank Ragnow's retirement. He kept it simple. 30 of their 35 runs were either inside zone or duo blocking, double teams, easy reads, physical football. By simplifying, he allowed the guards to settle in and control the line of scrimmage. That opened up the run game, and from there, the play-action passing game looked crisp and efficient. That's smart coaching, not trying to reinvent the wheel, but maximizing the strengths of the roster and letting the game flow naturally from the trenches outward. On the other side of the ball, Kelvin Shepherd deserves huge praise. The way he schemed against Lamar Jackson was unlike anything we've seen. They only rushed 3, but used 2 linebackers in tandem to spy Lamar, one off the ball and one on the ball. Wherever Lamar looked to escape, someone was waiting. It completely neutralized one of the most dynamic playmakers in football. That's not easy to do, and it showed a level of preparation and discipline that speaks volumes about Detroit's staff. And when I heard them breaking this down, I couldn't help but think about how this happens across sports. It reminded me of what's been said about Quentin Grimes in New York. People questioned whether he could step up when given a bigger role, and sometimes fans even doubted his consistency. But when he responds and proves he can handle the responsibility, suddenly the entire perception shifts. Morton and Shepherd are in that same spot, called out early, but when it mattered, they delivered. And now the conversation is completely different. So, in the end, SportsCenter really hammered home this balance. Detroit responded exactly the way a contender should. Yes, Baltimore's defense has its issue, but the Lions didn't just take advantage. They imposed their will. And that's the sign of a team that knows how to respond when the pressure's on.